let's look at the precedents of two previous world wars. In both cases, the American people didn't want to go to war in Europe. I mean, in the run-up to World War I, 90% of Americans didn't want to have anything to do with it. And what happens is that the Europeans get themselves into trouble. So they push forward, they orchestrate the big war, and they even start taking some serious pain, right? And then they use this to put pressure on the Americans, like, oh, you can't just let us die here. You can't look at what the Russians are doing to us, or the Germans, or whoever. You have to come and help us. And they do have this common bond with Britain, the language, the culture, which, if things get really, really ugly, and we have to always remember that the British control the American media, the press, that the pressure to join the European war could become unbearable again. And then if that doesn't do the trick, then you can always orchestrate some kind of a sinking of the Lusitania, or a Pearl Harbor, or some other kind of a false flag event, which then is going to galvanize American public opinion, and then get the United States involved in a war, in World War III. The difference now is that the United States, First World War, Second World War, the United States was protected because it has two oceans there, right? So it's very difficult for any invading force to do any harm to them. Today, in the age of nuclear ballistic missiles, in the age of hypersonic missiles, that is no longer any kind of a security. So if the United States got involved in a war against Russia, they would find themselves also in war against China. And they no longer have that, they would become a belligerent and fully exposed to the risks of Russian hypersonic missiles, or even a mutual nuclear annihilation. So in this sense, I think you can't, if you cross a certain line, then you can no longer contain the damage. You can no longer predict how it's going to play out. It's easy to cross that line, but it's very difficult to then control the fallout. And so from this point of view, I think that Trump, again, we have to guess that he's aware of all this. He's giving the impression that he doesn't think that far, but I believe that he understands this, and I think that they will not cross the line, and they will not take the risk of going to war against Russia, and that they will definitely muzzle the European powers that want to trigger this war. And I have to say this: I'm only basing this on a hunch, on an idea, but I think that the American side has told the British, do not dare to stage a false flag attack. We know you're up to it. Don't do it. We know you're up to it.
The danger, Alex, with this sort of attitude, if it seems you want to fight someone, or many of these, the two people are fighting each other. Most of the time, I think more than 90%, the two people didn't know beforehand, before fighting each other. It happens. It's something. It's at the moment you decide about fighting someone. You're not planning for it. You're not going and studying how to fight. And the same happened, even with the case of Russia, or you remember the conflict, the base of the conflict has started in 2014. Russia in 2022, when they decided to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, in eastern part of Ukraine, they didn't decide to fight, to go and to fight Ukrainians. They wanted to show some sort of leverage on Ukraine. They wanted to force Ukraine into some sort of deal. To the last moment, Donald Putin himself said that. they haven't, they didn't know if they want to fight or they don't want to, because this is the reality of human being, Alex. That's why I think what Donald Trump is doing is, somehow this war can, the confrontation can happen without knowing that it's happening. This is the problem. I don't see this sort of, wisdom in the Trump administration to understand this escalation, selling more weapons, making fun of Europeans. After all, when we talk about Europe, you're talking about, a huge variety of people, mindset, cultural issues, historical issues. You cannot bring all of these problems all together and you say, I'm dominating them, I control them. There is no control over the behavior of these people.
You're right, Nima. But there's a very serious problem in Europe. The people who are in power are desperate to escalate the conflict against Russia to World War III scenario. And the only problem is that they are not capable of waging that war. So their idea now is to keep Ukraine fighting as long as possible while they prepare their own nations for the war, the Brits, the French, the German, the Poles, and so on. And then they're also trying to kind of leverage the Moldovans, the Romanians. They tried with Georgia. It seems that didn't work exactly, but they will continue trying. They're not going to give up. And so, I asked myself, what would I do if I were in charge, if I were negotiating these things myself? I would maybe consider forcing the Europeans to make that decision sooner before they're ready. Almost push them to the point where you say, okay, you wanted a war, now go. Here you go. Here's your opportunity. Not give them 5 years to invest all these hundreds of billions of dollars into new weapon systems and train up tens, hundreds of thousands of troops, run propaganda campaign demonizing Russia, preparing people, like Germany in the 1930s, like Ukraine after 2014, to force their hand now to say, you want war, right? You want to go to war? Well, go. We're giving you everything. We're behind you. We're not going to fight with you, but go. Because, that would bring them to a breaking point, because people like Friedrich Merz and Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, they would all have to stand in front of their people and explain to them that we have to go to war against Russia. And I think that would cause all these governments to fall. So, that's a possibility, to simply force their hand, to force them to make a mistake before they are ready to negotiate the consequences. That may seem like 5D chess, and people always think like you're giving Trump too much credit. They're not thinking things through that far. But Trump is speaking with the Russians. I mean, Trump, people on his team, they are speaking with the Russians on a very regular basis and at a few levels. There's more than one delegation that are keeping regularly in contact with each other. They're keeping in touch with the Chinese. They all know where the danger is coming from. They all know who is destabilizing the world. I think that Trump wants to see the end of the European Union. I think he wants to deal with the ADF. He wants to deal with Assemblée Nationale in France. He wants to deal with Orban and Fico and these people. He doesn't want to deal with Ursula von der Leyen and with Merz and Starmer. And so increasing the heat, increasing the pressure to go into decisions that they can't really back up is the way to precipitate their decline. So I think that that's entirely possible. I wouldn't be surprised, actually. So, that would then explain Pete Hegseth's otherwise inexplicable performance. Like if you take it at face value, you would think these people are all completely insane. They're going to plunge us into World War III. But I don't really think that this is their intention.
Alex, 2 days ago, there was an interview with the former head of national security of Iran. And in the interview, what he was revealing about the attack, the fight between the war between Iran and Israel, he said that in the final days, Iran knew that Israel is just losing. And he said that the only reason Donald Trump came in and the United States has decided to interfere was the situation with Israel. And this guy is a really serious guy. He's not talking that much. He's a military man. He's the former defense minister of Iran. And it's not that. It's not about propaganda. He made legitimate. He said, we failed here, we failed there, honestly. And I think that he was based on the intelligence they had. He was mentioning that they knew each and every missile. Where did they hit? And, he knew exactly the details of those missiles. Where, he said the location they failed to, to hit, the locations that they could hit. Everything, he detailed everything. But after the outcome of what he said was that Israel was losing. Do you feel, with all that said, with the new peace deal in the Middle East, many people are arguing that Israel is preparing to go ahead and to war with Iran. When I hear Iranians, when I see what is happening in the Middle East, Donald Trump talking about the Middle East, say, if Iran gets, go after nuclear, we're going to hit them again. But they're not going there. And then, they're far from there. Do you feel, what is your understanding of the latest events? How can we, interpret the situation in the Middle East? Is the new war coming, or we can say that the war has made some sort of deterrent for Iran?
Well, it's that would be very difficult to predict, Nima, especially because pretty much everybody knows that you cannot trust the Israelis for anything. They can even put their signatures on some agreement, and then if it suits them to break it tomorrow, they will break it. Now, I think that one thing that Trump has done with this peace, and I think that was probably the most complicated part of it, was that he provided a kind of insurance policy for Netanyahu. So I think that almost an hour or two after you and I last spoke, I read the news that Yair Lapid, leader of Israeli opposition, committed that he would protect Benjamin Netanyahu if there were any votes in the Knesset against him. So, that takes pressure off of Benjamin Netanyahu, because the reason why he was keeping Israel at war was because he himself was finished. If the war finished, his political life would end, and he would most probably end up in prison. And so, and basically he's the Lord of life and death in Israel and over IDF. What he's in charge, literally. And so if you remove that danger from him, then he no longer has that pressure to keep Israel constantly at war. And I think this is also the reason why Trump is now pressuring Herzog, the president of Israel, to give a pardon to Benjamin Netanyahu, because then Benjamin Netanyahu is in the clear. He no longer needs war. And, obviously, every one of us would like to see Benjamin Netanyahu in court and in prison. But if that means that 100 Palestinians have to get killed every day, then I'd rather Benjamin Netanyahu be in the clear. And so I think that the risk of Israel starting a war against Iran again has gone down a lot. I do believe that Trump also told them, you go to war against Iran, you're on your own. I mean, he's already said this, but I think this is also part of this deal. So the illusion of the illusion of the Israelis, we're going to start the war, and then the Americans will have no choice. They're going to have to come in and fight it for us. I think that fell away. I think that probably Benjamin Netanyahu's perspective has changed a lot with this peace deal, and I think that the dealing between him and Trump was, okay, you stop bombing Gaza, you stop with attacks on Iran, and I'll make sure that you're okay. And so as long as Benjamin Netanyahu is there in power, then the deal has a chance to stick. If Benjamin Netanyahu is overthrown and something bad happens to him, then who knows? I don't know. It's going to be Ben-Gvir next or Smotrich, and then you're back to square one. But I think that for the time being, let's say that the detonator has been removed from this explosive mix, and this could all change tomorrow. But I think that this peace actually it seems to me that it has a chance of being sustained.
Is the United States, Alex, with all that said, is the United States capable of making peace with Russia? Is the identity of the United States, I'm not talking about the people of the United States, there's many of politicians in the United States, I'm talking about the core, the blob, the deep state. Are they capable of making peace with Russia?
I do believe so. I think absolutely, without a doubt. And I think that this is more likely than not. But it's again a relatively complicated thing, because there's a deeply entrenched Cold War mentality in the United States that for almost 100 years, the pervasive propaganda has been always anti-Russian, and then anti-Soviet, and then anti-Russian again. And this has been practically nonstop. And so a lot of people in American academia, in the halls of power, in the security state, the Pentagon, the CIA, and so forth, are committed Cold Warriors. And so they need to be purged from the system or removed from decision-making authority. And then, I think that little by little, the climate can be created for that peace to happen. And I think that at the very highest level of the government, between Putin and Trump, between their respective delegations, I think especially between the kind of chiefs of staff, the representatives of the U.S. military and the Russian military, I think that they already cooperate. They're all aware that the war between the two sides should be unthinkable because they have the power to mutually annihilate each other. And, maybe people in the city of London and on Wall Street think that would be, a risk worth taking. But I think that for the people in the military, they understand that it's not. And you remember, we even had, under Biden administration, people from the Pentagon stopped the Biden administration from sharing intelligence, not sharing intelligence, but authorizing long-range strikes into Russia, because Keir Starmer flew already to Washington with a list of targets in Russia to present to Joe Biden for him to authorize strikes against these targets. And then people from the Pentagon said, this is a really bad idea. We cannot do this. We will not do this. And then Biden, who is a committed pro-Ukrainian cold warrior, even he had to say, sorry, we can't proceed on this. I think that under Trump, this is probably even a lot stronger. We know that Trump administration has done a few very significant steps, like they have stopped sharing intelligence on their contacts with the Russians, with the British, with the Canadians, with the Australians, and with New Zealand, with the other four of the Five Eyes. They've also removed security clearances from, was it 27 or 37 of former high-level people in the Pentagon and the CIA and so forth. So I think that this purge of the cold warrior types from decision-making circuitry is gradually happening, but it'll take maybe a little bit of time. But I think that peace can be had. It will be had so long as Trump and Putin are alive, and you never know. If Putin drops dead tomorrow, who knows what happens? If Trump drops dead tomorrow, who knows? But I think that while the two of them are alive, I think it's more likely than not that we will have peace between Russia and the United States. And then, that's not such a shocking thing, because Russia and the United States are natural allies, and they have been allies throughout throughout the whole of the 19th century, and practically since the United States became a nation, they have been on very friendly terms. They had a very close friendship and an alliance for a very long time. Not necessarily because Americans and Russians love each other that much, but because they have really natural common interests. And these interests didn't disappear because everybody has been propagandized to ignore them. They're still there.
Yeah. Here is what FSB director Alexander Bortnikov, and he said that Russia has information about sabotage preparations against the Turkish Stream gas pipeline by British and Ukrainian special services. Do they really do? If they do that, how is that going to influence the behavior of the Turkish government? Are they going to react, in your opinion, from what we've seen so far from Erdogan and his administration? Or they feel, they're going to behave like the German government, or they can be compromised, they can be managed?
My guess would be that they will react like the Germans, at least Erdogan and his government, because they are very much in cahoots with British intelligence, and so if and they are covertly supportive of Ukraine, because part of the Turkish political class is very nervous about having a very, very powerful Russia dominating the Black Sea. So, while they don't want to go to war against Russia, they would like to play off Russia and Ukraine so that they keep each other weak and busy between each other. But what you can't predict is how the Turkish people might react to this, because Turkish people have been seeing all this happen, and they have been seeing Erdogan, fulminate against Israel and then do exactly nothing at all. And you can't predict that could be the drop that overflows the glass, and then maybe Erdogan ends up thrown out of office, and somebody else takes power who might be more radical, less compromised. It's hard to say, but as far as Erdogan is concerned, I think he would try to pretend like nothing happened, like the Germans. Turkish people, a different story, but not necessarily predictable.
Yeah. Alex, the case of Venezuela is coming to there was an article in New York Times yesterday said that Trump administration authorized covert CIA action in Venezuela to overthrow Maduro in Venezuela. What is this obsession with Venezuela? Bombing the boats. Nobody knows, these are civilians, because we have Colombians coming out. These were Colombian, people. And the other day we had people, other countries. I cannot remember. Burkina Faso. No, it wasn't Burkina Faso. It was the Trinidad and Tobago. And they came out and said that the United States killed some of their people because of these actions. Well, what is the obsession with Venezuela? Is that all about oil? Is that all about, the mindset of putting more pressure on Russia, controlling the oil industry, the market of oil?
No. It's not all about oil. There's also gold. There's other resources, but it's definitely to do with Venezuela's resources. Oil primarily, but there's more than that. I think that first of all, we have to understand where the pressure is coming from. Where is the pressure to overthrow Maduro government coming from? And it's not from Trump administration, and it's not exclusively from the United States. It's coming from Wall Street, but it's coming also from other banking centers, primarily the City of London. And okay, so in 2003, I think, early 2000s, Aaron Russo, he was a filmmaker. He gave an interview in which he said something very interesting and indicative, and so he became friends with Neil Rockefeller, one of the scions of the Rockefeller family, and they became personal friends. And he said in this interview how Neil Rockefeller told him that there was going to be an event, and he was talking about 9/11 terrorist attacks. And their conversation was before 9/11. But Neil Rockefeller knew that 9/11 was going to happen. And then he said, and then on the back of that event, we're going to declare war on terror. And that's really cool because there isn't really a real enemy. So you can go intervene wherever and then anywhere and everywhere, because you just have to say there's terrorists there and you go to war. So we're going to go to Afghanistan and Iraq. But he also said we're going to go to Venezuela. Okay, so the plans to take over Venezuela are not new. They're at least 20 years old and older. And then, in 2003, there was an attempt to overthrow Hugo Chavez, but that coup failed, and Hugo Chavez remained in power. He was rescued by his own people and his military. And then there was another coup attempt in 2019 under Trump. And in this case, they, Juan Guaido declared himself president, and everybody, in Europe, in London, Donald Trump, everybody said, oh yeah, Juan Guaido is the legitimate president. But then nothing happened. It all kind of got forgotten. And then Maduro is still in power since then. And, another way we know that the pressure is coming from a higher level than the US government is because the leader of Venezuelan opposition just won the Nobel Peace Prize, Maria Machado, right? Mm-hmm. Maria Machado is about the last person on this planet who deserves a Nobel Peace Prize, but she got it because there's a plan at some very high level to overthrow the Venezuelan government and to instill her. Trump wanted the Peace Prize for himself, but this tells you that it's not Trump's decision, it's somebody else's decision. And now, you have U.S. troops provoking Venezuela into retaliating, which then would probably give the American side a justification to intervene. But I have to ask myself, what can you achieve with 8 frigates and destroyers and 6,000 troops? You can launch some missiles, you can blow up a few things, but you can't take control of the country. I'm not certain. Let's say that the Venezuelan situation will give us maybe the most important indication of Trump, of who he is and where his loyalties lie. Because, as I said, I think it's pretty clear that the pressure to overthrow Venezuelan government comes from the banking cartel. And if Trump allows himself to deploy American military, American troops, put them at risk, to hand a victory to the banking cartel, to the global banking cartel, then Trump has betrayed his voters, he's betrayed everybody. If, on the other hand, he does like in 2019, does a lot of noise, a lot of these blows up boats, has CIA people running, I don't know what, in Venezuela, and then achieves nothing, in that case, maybe he's doing the right thing. That is, like in 2019, he made all the right noises. He said like, oh, I recognize Juan Guaido and, Venezuela, this and that, it all sounded very real, except that then he turned the whole assignment to John Bolton and Elliot Abrams, 2 of the biggest losers in the American political class that you could possibly find. So obviously they failed at this, and there was no regime change. Now, in the end, I have to explain why the bankers want a new government in Venezuela, because Venezuela has an estimated 300 billion barrels of crude oil, or maybe a little bit more than that. They have an estimated 185 tons of gold reserves. And all this, all these resources, you could buy them. You don't have to go to war to take them. You can buy them. And the United States is by far the biggest market in the hemisphere. And so the Americans could go to Venezuela and negotiate very favorable long-term contracts to make sure that all that wealth, all those resources flow to the American markets, to the mutual benefit of both the United States and Venezuela, paid for in US dollars, so that those dollars are recycled in the Federal Reserve in the United States, go to US treasuries and so forth. So it could be very good for both sides. But the banking cartel gets nothing, or, very close to nothing. The banking cartel wins a big win if they get control over all that resource wealth and they turn it into their own collateral, because then they can issue loans to their clients, like BP, like Exxon, like Royal Dutch Shell, and so forth. And those loans then become profitable assets on their balance sheets. And they can issue those loans because they would be secured with Venezuelan resources, Venezuelan oil or gold or whatever. And even the Venezuelan government could become the client of JP Morgan and Citigroup and so forth. And again, those loans to the Venezuelan government will be secured by Venezuelan resources. How much money is that? Just to give you a perspective, because back in April, I wrote an article detailing all this with respect to Alberta's crude oil reserves. So Canada. Alberta has an estimated 175 billion barrels in proven oil reserves. In the early 2000s or even in the late 1990s, the Rockefeller interests in New York were able to take control of that collateral. That turned it into $9 trillion worth of assets for the banking system. And most of that was used to create a new credit cycle. And the bulk of that went into mortgage, it blew up the credit bubble, the mortgages bubble, right? It was a $5 trillion bubble, which then burst in 2007, 2008. And then the banks turned around, and when the bubble burst, they went to the state to ask for a bailout. And according to the Government Accounting Office, they received at the very minimum $16 trillion in bailouts. And it wasn't just American banks. You know, this is the thing. It's not just American banks. The bailout went to Japanese banks, to French banks, to German banks, to Swiss banks. It was basically a massive looting operation, but that looting operation needed fresh money, good collateral in the system. Anyway, $16 trillion, just to give people perspective, because, you know, trillion, quadrillion, you know, people get lost in these zeros. Basically what it is at the very least $42,000 per every man, woman, and child living in the United States. That is far, far more than the big oil, than even the military industrial complex. Everything else, it eclipses everything else. It's the biggest prize if you take some country's collateral under your control. It's absolutely gargantuan. And so, you know, if 175 billion barrels of Canadian oil could be turned into $9 trillion of collateral into a $16+ trillion bailout, then imagine what you could do with 300 billion barrels of Venezuelan oil. You could do that same thing, only a lot bigger still. And basically, why am I pointing finger to the banks? Because they are the only group in society who have that incentive. No other group has that incentive. So they have the incentive, the means, and the opportunity. And this is where the pressure on Venezuela is coming from. And so if Trump hands them Venezuela, then he has betrayed everything that he claims to stand for. So to me, that's the one to watch. You know, things going on in the Middle East, I think I see a possibility of Trump playing a positive role. Ukraine, Russia, positive role. Venezuela is the one that worries me a lot, because I'm not sure that he's on our side there. But you know, we will know if the regime change operation fails. If it succeeds, and the Nobel laureate Machado becomes the new president of Venezuela, then he handed a massive win to the bankers.
Yeah. I believe that Venezuela is so much important, and I don't know what is the policy of Russia, China, and Iran, but I really want them to support Venezuela.
Yeah, it's there's a lot we don't know. It's very complicated. Venezuela has been under very, very tough sanctions by the Trump regime, and they practically broke diplomatic relations. And then when the war started in Ukraine, then the Biden sent a delegation to Venezuela, and they had very extensive negotiations, and they came to agreements that are not fully disclosed to the public. So ostensibly, it was about sending oil to the United States. So they kind of lifted sanctions to make it possible for Venezuela to sell their oil to the United States. Okay, that seems legit and fair, but there were other parts of the agreements that were not disclosed, and I suspect that part of it was because, one part of the Biden administration agenda was to draw all these illegal immigrants into the United States. And it seems to me that they went to the Maduro government and said, like, could you maybe send us your, empty out your prison and send these people our way, send them to the United States. And that the Maduro government said, like, all right, fine, that's what you want, that's what you get. And that they actually then really emptied out their prisons, and all these drug gangs and were really sent over to the United States. So that adds another dimension where the Trump administration has a huge problem with the Maduro government. But then Maduro government, they sent secretly a delegation to talk to Trump people, and they said, like, hey, look, we stop all this. We're going to sell all the oil to you. We're going to give you preferential treatment. We're going to stop sending oil to China. We're going to cut our ties with Venezuela and with China. And you can have absolute priority in developing all of Venezuela's resources. Apparently, the answer was no. Apparently, they told them, no deal. We're driving for regime change. So it's the situation is a bit more complicated than we know, but we know that it is complicated. And what's going to happen, I'm not sure. But again, it's Wall Street and the City of London that's in the driver's seat here. And if Trump makes himself their minion, then that's going to be a profound disappointment.